Hi, I'm Rick. Welcome to Elbow Shots. In this video I want to talk about sequencing. That is the order in which you put the pieces on. I'll also show you a sample layout, how I handle large sheets, and a couple of other secret tips to help you get professional results. I'll leave a lot of steps out in this video because this video assumes that you already know basic installation. If you've not seen it already, please take a look at my basic installation video. Let's take a look at today's project. Here we have a long countertop with a short L and a small top on the other side of the stove. We'll get all of our pieces out of this 5x12 sheet. First, we'll get our measurements. Measure in a couple of different places and cut to the longer one. In this case, I use 137 and 7/16. If I keep my cuts parallel and perpendicular to the sheet, it makes it easier to keep everything straight. The depth is the same at both ends, 26, so I add a ½ inch to allow for fitting and trimming. I measure the length of the L to the stove opening and add about a ½ inch there. The depth on this leg is a ¼ inch narrower than the long one, so I'll cut it at 26 1/4. Also, we want to cover the exposed back side of the self edge, so we'll need the back of the deck to extend 1/8 of an inch to cover that. With an overhang on both sides of the counter, like this one, I add 3/4 of an inch to the total width, which leaves 3/8 overhang on each side, instead of the full ½ inch needed when fitting to a wall. Now that we have our deck measurements, we check the depth of our self edge. They used a standard 1x2, so our depth is 1.5 inches. Notice that I shaved a little off the top of the cabinet style to allow the self edge to sit flat. Sometimes when I set my laminate slitter, the fence gets cocked at an angle, so the lock bolt isn't really holding. I always wiggle the fence to make sure everything is seated correctly. If you don't, the fence could slide while you're cutting strips. Let's head out to the garage where the laminate is relaxing on the floor. Everything comes out of this one 5x12 sheet, which is actually 61 by 146 1/2. For our short leg, I measure 39 3/4 from one edge and mark it. Then measure 19 1/2 from the other edge. That leaves a little more than 1.5 inches. That's all I need, so I could cut it up that way. It's perfect. But what if I didn't have quite enough width to make that work? Let's take a look at our options for using the piece that falls from the L. We measure over 26 1/2, add the 19 1/2, and that still leaves us with 15 inches of material. So for the sake of this video, I'm going to cut 2 full-length strips for self edge, which won't leave enough balance to get my 19 1/2 inch deck. So I'll have to get it from the fall. We'll come back to that later. I'm going to put this bonus piece on first. Really, it's just an exposed backside of the cabinet, so once that's done, we can begin our normal sequence. First, I want to make sure the particle board edge is covered, so I notch out for the cabinet. Instead of working with a small piece, I use a longer piece and then cut it after I get it fitted. The cabinet box sticks out past the end of the wall, which makes our self edge look short. So I'm going to slide it in a little further, tuck it behind the wall. There's no easy way to trim the top of the self edge once it's tucked behind the wall, so I pre-cut it. Now I can trim the piece to length and glue it. Because the piece is too small to get my roller on, I use a block of wood and a hammer to create pressure for the bond. Overhanging bars can create challenges. I can't get my nippers into position, so I'll use the toothed edge of my file to shear the laminate off flush. Now we can begin the normal sequence. My longest length of self edge butts in on both ends, so I fit and glue that first. While that glue is drying, I cut my other pieces to length. We fit the end caps next, 2 inside the stove opening and 1 next to the walkway. After those pieces are rolled on and the ends filed off, we can install the 2 front pieces on either side of the stove. The result is when you look at it from the front, you don't see the black edge of the laminate from the side self edge. Meanwhile, back in the garage, this is what I've been doing while waiting for self edge glue to dry. For the inside corner, I measured the depth of my counter, 26 1/2, and add 2 1/2 inches, which is the width of my straight edge. I'm not going to cut all the way into the corner. Sheet laminate tears easily at a 90-degree cut. So I stop scoring back away from the corner, then angle cut across from end to end of those score marks. This gives me a much stronger corner for transporting and handling. I've seen people slide a block of wood underneath and use a hole saw, and then that way they get a radiused corner, which is also very strong. I don't know what they're using for backsplash on this one, but it only takes a few minutes to fit it to the wall, and fitted sheets make assembling the countertop easier. There's just a little fullness in the end. We'll clean that up next. Starting with the long wall, I'm just going to use an ultrafine marker laid flat against the wall to scribe my line. The pressure of the pen forced the sheet down into the corner, distorting it and giving me a false line. So I'll just lift it back up into place and remark it. You can see the pen follows the contours of the wall, giving me a clear scribe line. I'll trim that off with hand shears. You can see where the cabinet installer needed a shim to keep the front edge straight. So I lifted the other end and slid the sheet over far enough to let it lay flat on this end. I don't need to remove much, so I angled the pen to mark closer to the wall. Just need to keep the angle consistent. Since this wall isn't finished, we're only concerned with covering our self edge. I just want enough overhanging the back to file off easily, so I'll trim a little off this proud stud here. Once the glue is dry, I set out my blind slats. Most of them are 27 inches, but the ones I use for the corners are about 42. I always use 5 in this situation. Put 5 in, take 5 out. Now how do you handle a 12-foot countertop with a 6-foot wingspan? Like I did to bring it in from the garage, I bow the sheet up in the middle and control the ends. I stabilize the L with my left forearm. With the largest part up on there, keeping a high bow in the sheet, I work back and forth to get it into position. It's flexible but also directional. You can get away with a lot of bowing, but not much twisting. With the sheet in place, I make sure it isn't hanging up on the walls anywhere. I pull the slat out closest to the end wall and lightly press that down. At the other end, I recheck positioning and pull slats. I always use 5 in the corners. I only pulled out 3, so 2 of them must have shifted when I slid the sheet over. I checked to make sure those were the only ones out of place. I pull the rest of the slats out, and I'm lightly brooming out the big waves. I don't want to apply any pressure until the sheet is laying flat. Beginning with the wall, press down on the laminate until it is completely flat. Broom it out by hand. Working from one end to the other, I roll the field first, and then the edges, paying attention to where the sink cutout is to avoid rolling where there's no backing. Pay special attention to the front edge. Now we need a pilot hole for the router bit. I usually use a screwdriver or the end of a file, but this was handy. I start in the back left corner because it's easier to trim the back wall if you do it first. If you're using a router with a standard base, you'll likely still have about a ½ inch overhang to trim off. If you make sure it is well bonded and you roll it down well, you can use a file to finish the cutout. Be careful though, that edge is extremely sharp and jagged. If you have an offset router base, you can trim it that way. This one is old and the belt is worn, so it slips. That's what that sound is. With an overhanging bar, even the offset router can only get so close. So with a sharp utility knife, I can underscore that tab and just snap it off with my fingers. Again, the overhanging bar is restricting access to my workspace. I can get this one edge, but the backside is a no-go. This is one of the reasons I only left a slight overhang. A standard file with the handle still attached only allows for a short stroke. I happen to have a file that accidentally had the handle broken off. I'm just going to say that steel is brittle. What seemed like a setback when I broke a brand new file turned out to be a blessing. A file with no handle works well in tight places. Looks like my work here is done. And that's how I did that one. If you found some useful information in this video, please like, share, and subscribe. It helps keep this channel going. Thank you for watching.